So I'm going to start with how I got interested. I'm a big history person and I love trivia and things like that. And I don't know that I knew the history from the big book when I read the big book. When I read the big book the first time, I, uh, I really don't know how much I retained of it. And I don't think I picked up any of the history. In fact, I didn't even know the 12 steps were in the big book. I thought they were like in Bill's story, and I was trying to figure out how to match those up with what were on the wall until I got to how it works. And I saw the 12 steps there. I didn't even know that. And so early in my recovery, I was reading books like I didn't know about Dr. Bob's and the Old Timers and A Comes of Age and things like that. And I was interested. I go to my home group does the big book on a rotating basis. It starts with the preface and goes through the end of the stories and then starts over and over again. And then at one point, we even made it so that on Mondays we did the first 164 pages. And one of the things that I always thought was interesting was that they would talk about the people in AA would say that there's been no changes to the first 164 pages. I didn't read and pick up the where it talks about that it's supposedly not changed. Now I gave out a handout. Now it's better when it's color coordinated, but it shows that there are 410 changes to the first 164 pages. So there are a lot of changes to the big book. And when what I did was I'd listen to meetings and people would talk about things. And then about 5 or 6 months into sobriety, I read a book about Bill Wilson by Susan Cheever. Angie, I thought her father was a famous author and he was actually saved by AA. And I took the book with me, and it's important. I'm not trying to bore you, but this book is important to my story because when I first got to AA, I was deathly afraid of relapse. I didn't have a physical desire to drink, but I had a mental obsession with relapse. I was certain that I was going to relapse. And so I was doing, like, if my sponsor said you have to go to a meeting early and stay late, if I was running late because traffic was bad, I would think, like, I'm going to drink if I don't get to that meeting. I mean, that's how stressful I was. And I had a lawsuit in, not Akron, I had a lawsuit in Reno, Nevada. And I'm not saying this to pick on Reno, but I called Reno a soulless city. What I mean by that is, like, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh's the steel city, right? And Wilmington and Delaware is chemicals, Philadelphia's, they're just the city of brotherly love. They have like a feel. Reno is the northern Vegas, right? It's like we got to figure out a place for people from San Francisco where they can drive to Nevada and gamble. That's what Reno is. It wasn't really even a city. It was a place where there was a river and people would fill up when they were going to California, they'd fill up their wagons with water and everything before they went into the mountains. And so I'm in Reno alone and I'm hitting meetings there and everything, and I'm reading this book and it's about Bill Wilson. I do not suggest you read this. If you're going to go from this and say one of the things that Eric mentioned was this book by her, do not read it. It is extremely depressing. So I'm in Reno, deathly afraid of relapse. I'm reading this book, and the end of the book, and there's a 3 hour time difference, so I'm waking up at say 3 a.m. And I'm reading this book, and the end of it is Bill Wilson dies in his attic screaming for booze. Now I don't know if that's true or not, but that's how she has it. He dies of emphysema. He's in his attic, and the last verse is he's begging for booze. And I'm like, this is just effing great. This is my course in life. I'm gonna end up dying in an attic, begging for booze, right? So I'm in Reno. I'm deathly afraid of relapse, and I get to this wonderful ending of Bill's life, and um, it was my emotional and spiritual bottom. And at that moment, I fell to my knees and I asked God, "Will you please just help me? I can't do this anymore." And I felt instant relief. I had what we'll talk about. I had a spiritual experience. I had a bright light moment. I felt, if you ever put a bottle upside down, you pull a cork out and the water comes out of it. I felt the stress go from my head through my body, and I felt calm. And I realized at that moment that everything was going to be okay. that everything was going to be okay so long as I didn't drink or drug. I could do anything else, but I couldn't drink or drug. And if I didn't drink or drug, things would be okay. They wouldn't be what I wanted them to be necessarily, but that I would be okay, that things would work out. And that really was a huge turning point for me. So the next thing I did was I read a book called Spirituality of Imperfection, which I suggest. And it talks about how perfectly imperfect we are. And the author of that is a guy named um, Ernest Kurtz. And he wrote a book. He's famous for his PhD initially. He got his PhD because he wrote a non-alcoholic uh, history of AA for his dissertation. And so I went and read that. And when I read it, I started to realize a lot more about Bill and Dr. Bob, that they were human and they're real. Like when you first come into AA, they're made into idols, like they're perfect beings, right? And they created this perfect program and they can't possibly have had problems. And then when you read Not God, you realize the struggles and the things that happen and how cool it is that we ended up where we are. So I've read all the books up there about history. I love them. They're all wonderfully inaccurate in their own way, and I'm wonderfully inaccurate. So don't like if you have a different understanding of something in the history of AA, I believe you because the more I research it, the more it changes from author to author. Okay, and so if you read it or if you're sitting here and say Eric's wrong about that, that's perfectly fine. I'm just going to give you my understanding. I am not a paid professor. I don't have my notes footnoted. I use a whole host of different subject that I go from, not just Not God. I've used the big book. I use Dr. Bob and those. I go online. One of the big things I love to do is go online to find out who the people are that are really in the big book, and I'll talk about that. Um, and I just love to assimilate it. I love to go to things I didn't know about the bedevilments and the promises and how they matched up. I heard that from Father Mark for the first time. I went back and looked at them like, holy cow, they really do match up. It's wonderful. And so I really started to become a student of the big book. And so let me talk about the history of AA in the big book as it is in the big book. And then I'm going to talk about uh, how it really works with more like a factual thing. So let's start. I don't know if any have one, but if you start, the notion is think of big AA in the beginning as this guy named Roland Hazard, and I'll talk about him, Ebby Thatcher, Bill Wilson, and Dr. Robert Smith, Holbrook Smith. Okay, think of that history because that's what is in from the preface to Dr. Bob's Nightmare. There's the story of AA in the big book. Is there a location where you can find all of that? Yes, it's called the foreword to the second edition. And the foreword to the second edition was written in 1955, and it does a short history all in one location. But in the big book, that flow is, if you want to rate, is Roland Hazard to Ebby is in There Is a Solution, okay? And it talks about on page 26 of the big book, I guess maybe it's 25, but no, 26. Is it 26? No, no, no. Starts on page 26, and it says a certain American businessman had ability, good sense, and high character. That's Roland Hazard, okay? And he is the person treated by Dr. Jung, Jung, okay? And he's on page 26. And it does not talk about him going and meeting up with Ebby Thatcher in there, but on pages 26, 27, and 28 of There Is a Solution, that is Ebby Thatcher. Roland Hazard. So the next, Ebby to Bill, is in Bill's story at pages 8 through 13. He is the school. I think it's what is it? He's the old school friend who shows up, and we'll talk about his full real name in a little bit. But Ebby Thatcher meets Bill in the big book. If you're not looking at the second edition forward, he's in Bill's story from pages 8 through 13, including one of the beautiful things about how Ebby kept visiting Bill. So if you think he only visited Bill once, he visited Bill before he went into the hospital, and he visited him 3 more times while he was in the hospital. And they were both in prep school together. And then the next is Bill to Dr. Bob. And there are 2 places that you go for that. First is you go to A Vision for You on page 153, and it says, years ago in 1935, one of our members made a journey to a certain western city. Now, I think in 1939, Akron was a western city. Okay. Los Angeles probably didn't exist, but that's when they talk about years ago in 1935, that is Bill heading to Akron. Okay. And it's also picked up in Dr. Bob's story, obviously. And then you have in Dr. Bob's Nightmare, Bill, Dr. Bob, and Bill number two, and I'll talk about him later. He's extremely important to the story because he's the first alcoholic who was not a member of the Oxford group to get sober. So, it's a very empowering person for Bill and Dr. Bob is Bill number two, and he's in Dr. Bob's Nightmare, and he is also at pages 179 and 80, and he's the corker on page 156 of A Vision for You. That's Bill number two. And like I said, the forward to the second edition contains the whole little kind of story of the whole thing. And if you want, afterwards, I can show you the names. And at the end, I'm going to show you like who Fred is. I'll let you know who Fred is. I'll let you know who Jim is, although there's a debate as to who Jim is. And we'll go through that. And I can even tell you who the guy is who pulled out his carpet slippers and tried to stay sober without AA and died when he relapsed. And it's a guy named Peabody who wrote a book called The Common Sense of Drinking, and he died of drinking. So now let's start with, okay, Eric, you're trying to tell me that the big book isn't perfect. So here's one of the big things. I did not know this, but I have this reprint of the big book. Now, I did not pick this up ever, but if you go, first of all, there aren't 164 pages in the first edition. There are 179 pages. The doctor's opinion is not done with Roman numerals. You do not start on page one with with Bill's story. Page one is the doctor's opinion. So there are 179 pages in the initial printing. Also, if you think the steps are perfect and they've never been changed, that's not true. Step 12, listen to what it says. This is from the initial printing. Having had a spiritual experience as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. What's the missing word? Awakening. They changed the 12th step in 1940 with the second printing of the big book. Not the second edition, but the second printing. And I'll talk about that, why they did that. So some of this will be maybe boring. I'll try and make it interesting as much as I can. But if you want to know why you can't just, and there's nothing wrong with this. This is the textbook. It is not a history book. It is the program of recovery. Okay? It doesn't have to be perfect. Don't be mad that, like I just pointed out, that the 12th step was changed. But so you know why you have to take it with a little grain of salt, and it's okay, is if you look at the preface to the big book, it says the second printing of the first edition added the appendix spiritual experience. And it says right there, we've changed the big book. It doesn't mention that they changed the step, but they tell you, even in the second printing in 1940, we've already changed it. We've started changing it. And they did it based on experience. Their experience, strength, and hope. They weren't afraid of changing it. And when I get to it, I'll show you how we went from the 6 steps to the 12 steps while he was writing how it works. And I have the original 6, and I have how it goes next to 12, and then they change it. So let's now go to the beginning. And so I call the beginning of the beginning is 1931. And 1931, there's a guy named Roland Hazard III. That should give you an idea of who Roland Hazard is right off the bat. Roland Hazard is a businessman and a member of a prominent Rhode Island family. He's the guy in the big book who ends up drunk as a skunk in Switzerland. Okay? And he is the eldest son of a prominent Rhode Island family. And at that time, now this comes from other things, not from Not God. In that family, the eldest son would take over the family business. So let's say you're the younger children, and the eldest son is a raging alcoholic. Okay? So what are you thinking? We're in big trouble. because he's going to take over the family business, and he's a drunk. So he struggles with alcoholism. And if you want to know what the family, this is, again, I hope this doesn't bore you. It interests me, but the family business is a company called Allied Chemical. Has anybody in here ever heard of Honeywell? Okay, that's Honeywell. That just to show you how these things flow. Allied Chemical becomes Allied Signal, which I remember, which then merged in another company and becomes Honeywell. That's how prominent Roland Hazard III is. If you want to know, I mean, that's how big deal he is, and it plays in as you go through. So he struggles with alcohol, and although he's not named in the big book, he's mentioned in there as a solution. His specific name is not used. He's used in other literature, but and his name's misspelled a lot. But in 1931, he's treated by Carl Jung in Switzerland. Does everybody know who Sigmund Freud is?
Yes.
Okay. Carl Jung is a student of Sigmund Freud, and he is one of the most prominent doctors for alcoholics in the world. And when you're a very prominent family from Rhode Island with a very powerful company and a lot of money, you send your kid to Switzerland to get him sober. That's your Hazelden in those days, okay? So he's treated for a long time. He gets on a train. He's going home, and he doesn't even make it to Paris from Switzerland, and he's drunk. Gets back on the train. He goes back to Switzerland, and Jung says, as you all know from the big book, he basically says you're screwed. You can either be locked away and guarded, or you have to have a vital spiritual experience. And that is what, by the way, Carl Jung uses, vital spiritual experience. Now, where that comes from is, as we know, we'll get to it, is a famous book, The Varieties of Spiritual Experiences by William James. Yeah. And so Carl Jung is a little bit on the edge with treatment because, unlike a lot of medical and other types of doctors at the time, he is pushing vital spiritual experiences, which is not mainstream. And so he suggests that, and Roland Hazard has some knowledge of a group called the Oxford Group. And so he returns. Now, the Oxford Group is an evangelical Christian movement in the United States. And he has some connection to that somehow. And he comes back and he goes, it's located in New York City, and it's at Calvary Episcopal Church in New York City. And it's the lead person in the U.S. is a guy named Samuel Shoemaker. These people are important because we don't hear them a lot in AA now, but between 1935 and 1950, Bill constantly credits them with him being sober. Now he breaks from them for a reason, but he does not abandon them, and he constantly plays up how important they are to what happened. But there are reasons why they break. But Samuel Shoemaker is the guy, and he is in New York, and they are believe their evangelical movement arises out of Sermon on the Mount. Has everybody heard of the Sermon on the Mount? It's in the Bible. There's a famous book about it, and that's what their evangelical movement comes out of, Sermon on the Mount. And who is it? Blanked on his name all of a sudden. Yeah, Emmett Fox, Sermon on the Mount. And they believe in the four absolutes: absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. So if you've ever wondered, when people talk about the four absolutes, you'll hear it in meetings all the time. Those are the four absolutes: honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. And again, this is it's a big deal. One of the things that you have to do when you go through it is you have to go out and you have to proclaim that you've had this experience. So they're evangelical. In other words, they go out and they proclaim things. So they're not anonymous, guys. They are not anonymous people. When they have their spiritual experience, they're supposed to go out and tell you that. And so Roland Hazard goes and he has a vital spiritual experience with the Oxford Group, and he does not drink again. He dies sober. And he would live from 1881 to 1945. And he is aware he's got to figure out, like, he's this evangelical, you got to take this out, right? And he becomes aware of a guy named Ebby Thatcher who is summering in Vermont, which I guess a lot of rich people summer in Vermont. And we have a lot of ties to Vermont in AA. Dr. Bob and Bill are both from Vermont. And it's in 1934. And Ebby is an alcoholic and pretty bad. and he drives, supposedly, the story is, he's drunk, and as he's driving his car, he drives it right into a house. And actually, supposedly, asks the people who are sitting at their table, aghast at this car in their house, can I have a cup of coffee? That's the anecdotal story. So he's probably in a little bit of trouble. Take it from what I do. It's not a good thing to drive through somebody's house when you're drunk. It's against the law. So he's about to be committed. The judge is about to commit him to an asylum called Brattleboro Retreat, and it's an asylum. It sounds neat. Hey, I'm gonna sentence you to a retreat. What it is it's like a institution with guards, and he's about to be sentenced, committed to Borough Retreat. Its other name is the Vermont Asylum for the Insane. So it's not really a retreat; it's an asylum for the sane. And so Roland Hazard and these I love these names just to give you an idea of where we come from. Roland Hazard, F. Shepard Cornell, and Sebra Graves. Those are the three Oxford members who go up to Vermont and they talk to a doctor. I thought it was upstate New York, but it's upstate, it's in Vermont. And they go up and they talk to the judge and they say, parole him to us. Now this is the time in America where there's a lot of class orientation. And so the judge is probably very politically connected, maybe from money as well. And here comes a very prominent Rhode Island person, and he comes up and he says, Judge, don't commit him to the insane asylum. Give him to us. We're going to take him back to New York and we're going to get him sober. And so the judge agrees, and he paroles Ebby to Roland in the Oxford group, and Ebby goes to New York. And so here is Ebby Thatcher's name, Edwin Throckmorton Thatcher. When I hear Edwin Throckmorton Thatcher, I realize that I'm a second generation American. He's a school friend of Bill Wilson at the Burr and Burton Academy. He is convinced by Roland Hazard that conversion is necessary. You have to have like conversion experience. And then he has his conversion experience at the First Calvary Baptist, and they tell him now you have to go out and proclaim this, right? You have to go out and be an evangelist. And he's sitting around, he's trying to figure out what to do, and he says, "Hey, I know a drunk. I know Bill Wilson." So he is the man in Bill's story. Now, just to tie him off, because I'm not going to speak a ton about him, there are a lot of I've read I've read stuff by Ebby Thatcher. I've read a really good book that's a series of letters between Ebby and Bill, and the stories that Ebby Thatcher had a resentment against Bill are absolutely positively false. I don't care. I've read the letters. I know people are going to say he didn't like it because he didn't get credit. Bill always credited him as his first sponsor. They were together, and Ebby Thatcher said his problem was women. He did not have a Bill problem. He had a woman problem. And he said almost all of his relapses were tied into relationship problems. Either the woman broke up with him or they died. And I've read those, and there's an interview with him. I don't know if it's in the early 60s or late 50s, but he said there's absolutely no truth that he does not like Bill Wilson. And he says, I have a woman problem. I have also know that he died sober in Ballston Spa, New York, and he died of emphysema. So if you've heard that he died drunk, I'm sorry, that's not true. And this is one of the ones where I will debate you. I know because I have seen the letter between from Bill Wilson to a man named Dick Caron. Everybody know the Caron Foundation? It was called Chit Chat Farms. Ebby Thatcher was last sobered up at Chit Chat Farms, and Bill writes a letter to Dick Caron and thanks Dick Caron and tells him that Ebby's about to die, but that he's sober and he's in upstate New York, and he thanks Dick Caron. And there's a letter at the Caron Foundation that's framed that has that letter from Bill Wilson to Dick Caron that says that Ebby Thatcher is sober. So again, you can read lots of different sources and come up with different things, but this is something I've actually seen. And one of my sponsees got me the book that's the exchange between Bill Wilson and Ebby Thatcher. So again, maybe they're lying in those books. They're not lying in the letter. And so he does die in upstate New York at Ballston Spa, and he dies of emphysema. which is not an unusual thing in those days because they all smoked like chimneys. So next, and the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to go through up to the big book and then we'll take a break. So the next person up is Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson is born on November 26, 1895, and he dies January 24th, 1971. Okay. He's born in East Dorset, Vermont, and he dies, believe it or not, in Miami, Florida. So I don't know what she was talking about him dying in his attic, but he died in Miami, Florida. His parents are Emily Griffith Wilson and Gilman Barrows Wilson. Both abandoned him when he was young. So Gilman was a drinker. Emily was not. Very hard, very driven woman, career oriented even back then. Ends up being a doctor. And one day, Gilman just doesn't come back. What I've read is the last to hear from him, he's like in Buffalo, New York, and then there's no history of whatever happened to him that I know of. Now there may be sources that have found it out, but I've not found it. But the last they seem to know of him, he's like going west through Buffalo from Vermont. And I don't, people might want to pass judgment on her, but she did not want to live in upstate Vermont the way that people were telling her she was supposed to live. And she went to Boston and she got her medical degree. And to do that, she left Bill and the rest of the kids in Vermont. And he was raised by his maternal grandparents, Fayette and Ella Griffin. And there's a great story of how obsessed Bill is. So his grandfather sees him one day and he's depressed. He's young. And he knows that Bill is a very goal oriented, driven person. So he tells Bill of a story that no American can make a boomerang so that it returns. Build a boomerang and throw it so that it returns. So what does Bill do? He builds a boomerang. He actually cuts a piece of his bed off and carves the boomerang out of his grandfather comes in and says, "Oh my goodness, the headboard is cut up. What's up going on?" And so Bill builds this boomerang. He's so obsessed with it that he's working and working. Then one day he comes in and he says, "Grandpa, come out." And he shows him, and he actually has built a boomerang and he can throw it and it returns to him. That's how driven a person he is. He is a type A personality. And he had been told no one outside of Australia could make one and make it work. And so he was determined to prove his grandfather wrong and show him I can make a boomerang and I can make it work. And he did. He then goes to Burr and Burton Academy, and he is a workday residential student. So he's not boarded there. He goes, so that's when you read in Bill's story and he talks about like how he's on the other side of the railroad tracks. He goes to this academy, and he's not one of the rich families, but he's a daytime resident. It's a coeducational school, and he runs into his first love there. And his first love is not Lois Wilson. His first love is Bertha Bamford. And Bertha Bamford is a student at the school, and there are letters between, they're very emotionally intimate. And she dies of complications from surgery in New York City. And Bill finds out about it when they call an assembly of the school, and the principal says, Emily's not going to be coming back to school. She died in New York. So let's start out with Bill now. We have Bill, abandoned by his parents, first love, dies in New York, and he finds out about it at an assembly. Pretty tough stuff when you think about it. So he meets Lois Wilson in 1913. They're engaged 2 years later, and they get married before Bill leaves to fight in World War I. So they're married on January 24th, 1918. Before that, he attended Norwich University, and he had to take time off because he suffers from depression and anxiety. So he's in school, and he's so depressed and he has so much anxiety that he has to leave school for a certain period of time. So again, if you think he's perfect, he's not perfect. He's perfectly imperfect. He has the same types of things that we have, depression and anxiety. I don't know about you. One of the reasons I drank was anxiety. I needed something that I thought could make me less anxious. And so he gets suspended for hazing. He never really does that well at Norwich. He has military experience, though, because he joins the Vermont National Guard in June of 1916. and then he becomes an artillery officer in 1917. And in 1917, as part of their training, this is in, you remember in the big book where he, in Bill's story, he talks about how he has his first drink as part of the military. The boys are going over there. Okay. So this is one of the fun things. So it's at a mixer, and I'm going to read you actually um, about his first drink out of Not God, but this is what his first drink was. It was a Bronx cocktail. So you know about Brooklyn, the Bronx. Okay, it's called a Bronx cocktail, and it is gin, vermouth, and orange juice. That's what his first drink is. So his first drink of alcohol is in 1917, and it's a Bronx cocktail. And just to go and describe, see if this doesn't hit. So this, I'm going to read this. Please don't get too bored. So this is his first story. Where is it? This is him talking about his first drink. Perhaps it took a little time, but it seemed to happen instantly. He could feel his body relaxing, a stiffness going out of him, his shoulders as he sensed the warm glow seeping through him into all the distant, forgotten corners of his being. Soon he had the feeling that he wasn't the one being introduced, but that people were being introduced to him. He wasn't joining groups, groups were forming around him. It was unbelievable, and at the sudden realization of how quickly the world could change, he had to laugh and couldn't stop laughing. It was a miracle. There was no other word. A miracle that was affecting him mentally, physically, and as he would soon learn, spiritually too. Still smiling, he looked at the people around him. These were not superior beings, they were friends. They liked him and he liked them. And after he left, at his back he could hear the whine of a saxophone, little waves of voices rising, falling, but now in no way ran against the overwhelming joy he was feeling. His world was all around him, young and fresh and loving, and as he made his way down the drive, he moved easily, gracefully, as though he knew exactly how he felt. All his life he had been living in chains. He was now free. That's his first drink, Bronx cocktail. And so when he talks about that, the party, it was a party thrown by well-to-do people, and it invited all the soldiers. He felt very uncomfortable. They said, "Hey, try this," and that's what ends up happening to him. So he serves in World War II as a second lieutenant, or World War I as the second lieutenant, and he's over there, and he comes back, and so I always think of again, uh, where are we in his life? You have to see he's abandoned by his parents. He goes to a school where he doesn't feel like he fits in. His first love dies, and then he's an artillery officer in World War One. That's a lot of stress, guys. Right. I mean, if you're wondering, but that's his buildup. And so between 1930 and 1934, Bill is a capital MESS. He becomes a mess, and he's in Wall Street. He has two business opportunities that he squanders due to his drinking. He was arrested and spent a night in jail, and he was too drunk to attend the funeral of Lois's mother. He's a mess between 1930 and 1934. They moved to 182 Clinton Street in Brooklyn, and that's Lois's father's house. So Lois and Bill moved to his parents' house, and eventually that house was given to him by her father, Doctor I blanked on her name also. What was her name? Blanked. I have it written down here somewhere. So they eventually get, and he's in his initial experiences, the two things that really help him out is there are two medical families that help him out. So he's looked over by two medical persons in his family relationship. His sister married a New York doctor named Dr. Leonard Strong. Leonard Strong will show up again later. He's one of the Rockefeller people, very important doctor. And his father-in-law, which is Dr. Clark Burnham, that's the name, and he's a doctor. And through them, he's admitted to what is called Charles B. Towns Hospital. So when you see the doctor's opinion, they talk about the hospital. It's Charles B. Towns Hospital. You hear it mentioned as Towns Hospital, whatever, but actually there's a doctor named Charles B. Towns, and it's his hospital, and it's a brownstone in New York. And it was there from 1909 to 1965. It's at 293 Central Park West, and it conducts experimental treatments for alcoholism and drug addiction. And we're going to get into that. and it actually helped draft drug control legislation in the U.S. in the early 20th century. It was one of the top places, and this is an important part of Bill's story that we don't really hear a lot about. They are famous for what is called the belladonna treatment. I don't. It was called the Townes-Lambert cure, aka the puke and purge treatment. Let me repeat that. The belladonna treatment was called the Townes-Lambert cure, or the puke and purge treatment. They feed you belladonna and henbane, which are called the insane roots. And it's a treatment that causes delirium, hallucinations, light sensitivity, confusion, and dry mouth. And it causes diarrhea and intestinal cramps. And it's a rehab for well-to-do patients. So what they do is, over a 3-day period, they keep feeding you this and not allowing you any sleep so that you have psychotic experiences. It's true. Think about how that plays into Bill's bright light moment. But that's what they're famous for. They're famous for the belladonna treatment. And Bill was committed there for the first time in 1933. He was committed either 3 or 4 times, and the last time he was there was from December 11th through December 18th in 1934. And the cost of his treatment was $125. I've seen the receipt. It's cute. And the primary treatment guy here is our next important Bolden, Dr. William Silkworth. He lived from 1873 to 1951. He treated over 40,000 alcoholics. He published in 1937 a book called Alcoholism as a Manifestation of Allergy and Reclamation of the Alcoholic. He saw alcoholism as a disease. He used the physical disease model, and he believed in psychotherapeutic treatment for alcoholics. So a mixture of medicine and what we call the spiritual treatment. Powerlessness and moral psychology is what he believed in. Powerlessness and moral psychology. During one such visit with Dr. Dr. Silkworth basically gave up on Bill and informed Lois that he would need to be institutionalized or he would die. So Bill goes through the treatment, doesn't recover, comes back, he's really bad, and basically Dr. Silkworth says he's not curable, and he's going to have to be institutionalized. After he heard this, and once he got educated on the medical nature of alcoholism, that it was a disease, Bill resolved at that moment not to drink again. This is important because he believes that helplessness in the future, he believes helplessness coupled with a spiritual awakening and helping other alcoholics are the 3 fundamental parts of Alcoholics Anonymous. The bottom, spiritual awakening, helping other alcoholics. When you read Bill's stuff, you talk about the steps, but that's what he believes. You have to think you have no other place to go. You have to understand you have to get a spiritual awakening, and you have to help other people. This did not last very long, as we all know. Armistice Day, November 11th, 1935. He's on his way to a golf course. The bus breaks down. He goes into a bar. The bartender says, "Drinks for free for veterans." And Bill goes right up to the bar and starts drinking, and he drinks heavily when he starts celebrating World War I. And then we start to the good part, the turning point. So Ebby Thatcher shows up in late November 1934. We know he was expecting to spend a day drinking and reliving old times. Bill was instead shocked by Ebby's refusal to drink. "I got religion," he reportedly said to Wilson's surprise. Ebby told Bill of his conversion at the rescue mission and acquainted Bill with the teachings of Roland Hazard about the Oxford Group's life-changing program, as well as the prescription of Carl Jung for conversion. Bill at first declined Ebby's invitation to sobriety and continued to drink in a more restrained way for a short while. Ebby returned. So again, you read in the book, you read he's only one thing and then he ends up in the hospital. But no, Ebby returns with a guy named Chef C. Bill hated him. He hated Chef because he thought he was too Ivy League and did not really know about hard drinking. He felt Shep and Ebby were talking too much. Bill wondered that if he at least needed to investigate the Oxford Group. So after leaving Silkworth at one point and considering this, because he went to Silkworth and he said, "What do you think?" And Silkworth says, "Why don't you investigate it?" So he goes down to Calgary Mission, and on the way he does what an alcoholic does, right? He bar hops. So he shows up at the Oxford group drunk, and he almost gets thrown out. And Ebby intervenes, and Ebby got Bill to be allowed to stay if Bill would eat copious amounts of beans and drink coffee. In those days, I guess they thought that you sobered up alcoholics by feeding them beans and having them drink a lot of coffee. Bill spoke at the meeting. I'm sure that was beautiful. And on the way home, he noticed that he did not stop once for a drink. Have you ever heard that story? I've never heard that. So he goes to the Oxford group at the mission, and as he returns, by the time he gets home, he realizes I didn't have a drink. He cites that as a religious conversion. He goes back to Charles B. Towns Hospital for drug and alcohol addiction on December 11th, 1934. Dr. Silkworth was not convinced. Ebby visits him on December 14th and essentially help Bill and what would be taking steps 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and 8. Bill has a spiritual experience in the hospital. He has a bright light moment. It's on page 19 of Not God. Let me read. It's a little dark up here. This is he describes this 2 decades later in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age. My depression deepened unbearably, and finally it seemed to me as though I were at the bottom of a pit. I still gagged badly on the notion of a power greater than myself, but finally, just for the moment, the last vestige of my proud obstinacy was crushed. All at once I found myself crying out, if there is a God, let him show himself. I am ready to do anything, anything. Suddenly the room lit up with a great white light. I was caught up into an ecstasy which there was no words to describe. It seemed to me in the mind's eye that I was on a mountain, and that a wind not of air, but of spirit was blowing. And then it burst upon me that I was a free man. Slowly the ecstasy subsided. I lay on the bed, but now for a time I was in another world, a new world of consciousness. All about me and through me there was a wonderful feeling of presence. I thought to myself, so this is the God of the preachers. A great peace strode over me, and I thought, no matter how wrong things seem to me to be, they are all right. Things are all right with God and his world. This stunned me when I read this. If I told you, remember I told you my story in Reno? I just knew that things were going to be all right. And I've had people ask me, like, do you believe there's a God? And I don't say I don't believe, I know. And I can't explain it. But I mean, to read this, I had not read that before I had that experience in Reno in 2007. But he said, a great peace, things are all right. But then he started worrying because Dr. Silkworth had warned him of alcoholic brain damage. Was this evidence of it? A hallucination founded on his obsession with Evie's sobriety? Hadn't he, after all, been doing strange things lately? Like that foolish scene at the mission? Almost fanatically, Wilson called a nurse and begged her to summon Dr. Silkworth. Let him decide, Bill thought. One way or the other, sobriety or institution, this was it. Only he had to know which. He talks to Dr. Silkworth, and Dr. Silkworth tells him, you are not crazy. Silkworth interviews him for a long time, probing questions, and he says he determined that Bill had a psychic upheaval and a conversion experience, and he was entirely sane. Guess who visits next? Ebby. He shows back up. He visits again and provides Bill with William James's Varieties of the Religious Experience. And from this becomes the beginnings of AA. So there's this whole thing, he goes to the mission, he comes back, he doesn't drink, he has the bright light moment in Towns Hospital. Ebby shows up, and Ebby hands him this book that's all about the varieties of spiritual experiences. And so Bill reads this, and he sees that deflation at depth followed by a spiritual experience or awakening, and that was the message that alcoholics need to carry, because non-alcoholics cannot transmit this message. So going back to he says, spiritual experience, James thought, could have objective reality, almost like gifts from the blue. They could transform people. Some were sudden, brilliant illuminations. Others came on very gradually. Some flowed out of religious channels, others did not. But nearly all had the great common denominators of pain, suffering, calamity. Complete hopelessness and deflation at depth were almost always required to make the recipient ready. The significance of this burst upon me. Deflation at depth. Yes, that was it. Exactly what happened to me. And that's Bill's words. Now, deflation at depth is not in that book. So we don't really know 100% where Bill got that from, but he believes in deflation at depth. And then he also realizes in order to stay sober, he has to work with other alcoholics. There's just something that hits him based on his experiences with Ebby that you you have to work. Now, I mentioned Mr. Peabody or the Richard Peabody. Richard Peabody, Alcoholics Anonymous was not the only mainstream. In fact, uh, the common sense of drinking was more well known than Alcoholics Anonymous in the 30s, and it was led by this guy named Richard Peabody. And Richard Peabody, I've read the book, and there are a lot of things in the big book that are borrowed from that book. Bill and Dr. Bob and the other members of AA were educated on alcoholism. They were trying to get sober, and they read lots of different things, and they included parts of common sense of drinking. But I've read it, and that there are two things different, entirely different, of common sense of drinking in Alcoholics Anonymous. First is he doesn't talk about a higher power. It's all about healthy living and disciplined living and things like that. And the second thing that Richard Peabody does not talk about, he does not talk about helping other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. There's the biggest differences between his theory of how to stay sober and Bill's theory is spiritual awakening and helping another alcoholic to achieve sobriety. So Bill leaves on 12/18/1934 and never drinks again. He dies sober. So if you're in your thing like when did he get sober? So if you're thinking about between this and June, where AA gets formed in 1935, this is the beginning. Bill in 1934 in December. All the things that happen up to Dr. Bob all happen in 6 months. Pretty amazing when you think about it. So he works in New York through the Oxford Group, and he is almost entirely unsuccessful. Almost everything's a failure. So he goes to Dr. Silkworth for advice, and Silkworth says, quit preaching to alcoholics. You need to go for deflation first. Explain the helplessness of the situation. Start with the medical diagnosis and give it to them hard. So he switches from preaching to saying, if you're an alcoholic, you're hopeless, medically helpless, and to you need to go through a spiritual awakening and other things. And that's how they start changing. So he's off to Akron, and he does this because he's staying sober a little bit. He still has friends on Wall Street, and they hire him to go to Akron. I don't know if people know what a proxy fight is, but a proxy fight is when two groups are trying to control a company. They both have what they consider the best idea for the company, and they're trying to get the shareholders to vote in favor of their idea. So Bill goes to Akron to advocate for one of the business solutions for this company, and they lose big. And they fail, and everybody with him leaves and goes back to New York. But Bill stays in Akron because he thinks maybe I'll find a loophole and somehow we'll win this proxy. So lonely one day, on the day before Mother's Day, May 11th, 1935, he's in the Mayflower Hotel. He becomes afraid that he will drink again. One end of the lobby is the hotel bar, and on the other end of the lobby is the church directory. Fear causes him to contact Episcopal churches for an Oxford group. So he's not calling hospitals, he's calling Episcopal ministers, trying to find an Oxford group, and he's trying to find a drunk Oxford group member. So he finally gets to how many times have you heard? So there are 10 names. He calls a minister, and the minister says, here are 10 names of people. How many do you think he calls before he gets somebody? 10. It's always the last one, right? How many stories have we heard about people who talk about they get the name of 5 rehabs to call, and the first 4 tell them F you, but the 5th one that gets them sober? That's the same thing. Bill calls 9 of the names. Nobody answers. Nobody returns a call. Nobody knows of anybody he can help. And the last one is a guy named Norman Shepard, and he directs Bill to Henrietta Seiberling. Henrietta Seiberling, if you haven't heard, people have talked about it, but Henrietta Seiberling is the woman who owns the mansion where Dr. Bob and Bill meet. And she is a Vassar grad and the daughter-in-law of the founder of the Goodyear Tire Company. So she directs Bill to Dr. Robert Holbrook, aka Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob and the wife Ann cannot meet with Bill on that Saturday because why? He is passed out under the dining room table. He'd come home on Saturday with a Mother's Day present for Ann. It's a potted plant. We read about that in Dr. Bob's Nightmare. He puts the potted plant on the table and he falls down and he passes out under the table. So Anne says, "We'd love to meet you, but he's drunk under the table." So do we want to keep going? Or do we want to keep going? Let's finish Dr. Bob and then we'll take a break. So Dr. Bob was born on August 8th, 1970 or 1879. He's another Vermont person, St. Johnsbury, Vermont. He graduates from Dartmouth College. He's an Ivy League guy. Remember we had Chef C and Bill didn't like him because he was an Ivy guy. Well, Dr. Bob's an Ivy guy. He works for for 3 years after college in business, but he realizes that he's always wanted to be a doctor, so he goes on to med school. If you think only dumb people get it in AA, he went to Dartmouth and then he goes to the University of Michigan for med school, one of the top med schools in the United States. He doesn't do too well there, as we know. Remember, the deans tell him, "Thank you for passing your first year of med school. Please don't come back." And so he ends up going to Rush, RUSH Medical College in Chicago. He's a resident proctologist at Akron City Hospital, and for 17 years, he cycles through drinking, recovering, drinking. That's the nightmare. So he stays a little bit sober during his residency. He gets a really good job at Akron City Hospital, and then for 17 years, he cannot stay sober. That's the nightmare. He just cycles through drinking for 17 years. Henrietta Seiberling. Now, Anne is looking for a religious. Anne Smith is looking. And Henrietta Seiberling has a dream. And in her dream, she is told by her higher power that she is supposed to help Dr. Bob. That's a pretty powerful thing when you think about it. She has a dream. And in her dream, her God tells her, "Your job is to help Dr. Bob." And so when Bill calls, she is all for this. And she gets Bill and Bob to spend May 12th together. Now, we all know Anne brings Dr. Bob over. He gets a promise from her that within 15 minutes, she's supposed to come and interrupt and say they have to go somewhere. They are together until midnight. Bill and Dr. Bob stay together until midnight. They then invite Bill to come and live at their house. And for 3 weeks, Bill works on Dr. Bob with intensive Oxford group work. So for 3 weeks, he's at their house and they're doing the Oxford program together. Early in June, we have a problem. Dr. Bob is supposed to go to the annual convention in Atlantic City. Anne does not want him to go. Bill and Dr. Bob sit down and Bill says, "Look, we live in a world with alcohol. You got to figure out whether you can live in a world with alcohol." So Dr. Bob goes. He relapses and does not communicate back at all to Anne or to Bill. So he's off in Atlantic City. He goes off to Atlantic City and he disappears. Where is he? Well, he comes back and he calls his nurse and she picks him up at the train station and he's drunk. She calls up Bill and Anne and says, "I got Dr. Bob here and he's drunk. And by the way, we have a problem." What's the problem? Well, he's supposed to perform surgery in 3 days. He's supposed to perform surgery on somebody in 3 days. So Bill and Ann start working on tapering Dr. Bill off of alcohol, and because he's in bad shape. And on the morning of the operation, Dr. Bob tells Bill, "I'm going to go through with it." Bill thinks Dr. Bob is talking about the operation. Dr. Bob says, "No, I mean I'm going to go through with the recovery program." Bill takes Bob to the hospital, giving him beer to steady his nerves. The beer in the car on the way to the hospital is Dr. Bob's last drink. Next problem. Ann and Bill don't hear from Dr. Bob after the operation. So they're sitting at home waiting for the phone call and they don't hear anything. All of a sudden, Dr. Bob rings and he says, "The operation was a success. Afterwards, I felt elation and I decided that I must work the program," and he went out and started making amends. That's what he meant by, "I'm going to go through with it." He had reservations. He didn't do the amends process of the Oxford group, and was make restitution, and that was what he meant. And he goes out and he started making amends. He was deathly afraid of what people thought of him. Does that sound familiar? And then he goes out and he makes amends, and what he finds out is people thought he was a drunk. So I don't have that worry anymore. And so he starts making amends. That's the day that Alcoholics Anonymous is formed, June 10th, 1935. So there are 4 moments. 1931, Carl Jung with Roland Hazard. November 34 with Hazard and Ebby, Bill's vital spiritual experience in the discovery of William James in December 1934, and Dr. Bob and Bill on June 10th, 1934. So let's take like a 5-minute break, bathroom, 10-minute break. It would look good. I should have worn a tie and my legs were patches.
I wish we had come up with a skit. Not for not for you to do, but the committee. How are we doing?
I think it's great. And now we're back.
So hopefully this doesn't show, but I'm extremely nervous. So I don't know if it's showing or not. I haven't sat up yet. So now we have Bill and Dr. Bob sober, right? And in the book they make it sound like they immediately go and get the next guy, right? Well, not really. Doesn't happen until June 28th, 1935. So in the book we have the June 10th date, and it makes it sound like that next day they go rushing down to the Akron City Hospital, but it actually doesn't happen until June 28th, 1935, and this is based off of like sign-in sheets and things. The person they meet is Bill Dotson, Dotson, aka Alcoholic Number 3 or Bill Number 2. He's a successful lawyer, a former city councilman, and has done 8 detoxes in 6 months. He also is prone to a little bit of physical problems because he just gave 2 nurses black eyes on his last trip. Bill D is visited 3 times by Dr. Bob and Bill. Between the second and third, he has a vital spiritual experience. Unlike Dr. Bob didn't have, he came a little bit along. We have Bill with his vital spiritual, and this is Bill number 2, Bill Dotson's spiritual experience. He decides between the second and third visit, if Bill and Bob can do it, I can do it. Maybe we can all do it all. We can all do together what we could not do separately. That was he had this realization: if these 2 guys can do it, I can do it, and all of us can do it for others. And that's his thing. Bill Wilson becomes extremely excited about, not only does he finally have somebody who stays sober, but to him, Bill D shows that Dr. Bob's not a fluke. Okay, remember, he hasn't had any success in New York. And then second, Bill D is the first recovering alcoholic that's not an Oxford Group member. So Bill realizes it doesn't have to be an Oxford Group person to get sober. That they could take somebody who has no association with Oxford Group and visit them, send their message to him, and he has the vital spiritual experience. So this is very empowering to Bill Wilson because he's not sure. Remember, they're trying to create this program and he doesn't know. So we have some interesting things, just some fun stuff. In the summer of 1935, they're trying to get people sober at Dr. Bob's house, and one day Ann is chased around the table by an alcoholic with a knife while Bill and Dr. Bob are out helping someone else. So, and during this time also, Ann and Henrietta Seiberly would spend time reading passages from the Bible and trying to infuse people with spirituality. Wednesday meetings were spent in the Oxford Group home of T. Henry and Grace Williams, and this is mentioned in A Vision for You. That's the house that they mention. The informal meetings are at T. Henry and Grace Williams' house, and they are Oxford Group members. They do not have a lot of success. Later on, Bill felt this failure was due to preaching too much and pussyfooting around the spirituality. He goes back to New York and he's trying to figure out why certain things work in New York and he thinks that was the problem. And here's something a lot of people didn't realize. Lois comes from New York and visits him while he's in Akron. They make it sound, I think, in the book, in the preface, or in the forward to the second edition, like he's there alone. But she actually comes out and she thinks that Ann and Dr. Bob are wonderful people. He leaves in September, and in September it was Akron. In Akron, they had Dr. Bob, Bill D, and one other sober alcoholic. Now, this is the devil may care person, the young chap that they talk about. the story I've heard, and I don't have any, is that Ann and Dr. Bob and Ann love to do Sunday, go out in the country and have a picnic. And she had a dream that they couldn't go out because they needed to be at the house for some reason. And this guy shows up, and she's, this is one of her spiritual things, is she felt that she had been talked to and told to stay, and that person stays sober too. Lois and Bill, they go back and they decide, we're going to create our own recovery house. We're going to take 182 Clinton Street and open up to alcoholics. And for 6 months, they do everything they can, and not one person stays sober. Okay. And from this, they realize you cannot let alcoholics become too dependent on other people. You can't do everything for an alcoholic. It doesn't work. And they cut back to weekly open houses. This is another thing that's mentioned in the book, but that's one of the informal meetings. Now he succeeds with two people, Fitz Mayo and Hank Parkhurst, and we'll talk about them later. But both of them, they're discussing the doctor's opinion. Hank Parkhurst is the unrecognized man. Remember when Dr. Silkworth talks about there's a man, a businessman, and he comes back a year later and he's unrecognizable. Hank Parkhurst was treated at Towns Hospital, and he was an executive. Hopefully I'll get to that. But he's the man he couldn't recognize him because he was so healthy looking when he saw him again. The other person is Fitz Mayo, and Fitz Mayo is the person that they recognize as the unrecognized, is the man who wandered off to die, and they find him in a barn. And that's the other person in the. So Silkworth he's not mentioning anybody from Akron in his doctor's opinion. He's only mentioning people who are getting sober in New York. And these are people that are brought to Towns Hospital. They met up with Bill, and they stay sober. And the first two of them are Fitz Mayo and Hank Parkhurst. Fitz Mayo dies sober. Hank Parkhurst dies drunk. Now we start to have problems with the Oxford group. Hank, Fitz, and Bill are more focused on the weekly meetings in Clinton Street and not about the mission. So they're not as going to the mission and doing it. And the Oxford group people aren't really happy about that. They're like, you're more focused on these weekly meetings you're having in Brooklyn and not the Calvary mission meetings we're having. And so there starts to be a little bit, and this is something I've seen this. People may disagree, and I'm not here to argue it, but in the spring of 1937, the Oxford group actually forbids alcoholics to go to his meeting. They don't want Oxford group members who are alcoholics to go to Bill's meeting in Brooklyn. And that's pretty much when he breaks off from the Oxford group. They break off from the Oxford group quite sooner than Akron, but they continue to use a lot of ideas from the Oxford group. New York is seen as New York was uncomfortable with the aggressive evangelism of the Oxford group. They didn't really feel comfortable going out and preaching that they had recovered alcoholics. One, there's the humility side of it, and two, they're deathly afraid of being labeled as alcoholics. Right? It's not mainstream to be still not mainstream to be an alcoholic, but they're not comfortable with the Oxford group telling them, okay, now you've recovered, you've got to go out and preach to people in an open way, and they weren't very comfortable with that. And actually, Akron called themselves the Alcoholic Squadron of the Oxford group. So in Akron, that's what their subgroup was, the Alcoholic Squadron of the This is the flying blind period that's mentioned in he sold himself short by Earl T. Mr. T, as we know him. He gets a woman sober, and she goes, I was visited by Mr. T, and everybody, whenever you read that story, everybody breaks up in the meetings. Earl Treat is Mr. T. He's mentioned in the foreword to the second edition of the Big Book, and in Soul Chart, he calls it the flying blind period, and that's from 1935 to 1939. And we know what happens in 1939. It's the Big Book. So in November 1937, Bill goes back to Akron. Bill and Dr. Bob figure they have 40 sober drunks among the two groups. So in 1937, they have the New York Independence happening from the Oxford group, and they have in New York they have Independence, and in Akron they have rapid growth of AA. Bill and Dr. Bob think they're onto something, and Bill runs 3 ideas by Dr. Bob. First, they want to have paid missionaries. Second, hospitals for alcoholics. And 3, a book. Dr. Bob is not very high on these ideas, and he finally agrees to the book. They run it by the Akron members, who are cool on all 3 ideas. They don't want to do any of them. But they finally agree over a minority of objections that they'll allow Bill and Dr. Bob to pursue these things. The idea of open and closed meetings comes from Akron. Regular Oxford group meetings was an open meeting, and the separate meetings at the Williams House was called a closed meeting. So the open meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous were a regular Oxford group meeting, and the closed meetings are when the alcoholic squadron of the Oxford group was meeting on their own. In 1938, we have Growth to Cleveland, which is the third C of AA. Bill goes back to New York, and Charles Towns, remember we talked about Dr. Towns? He decides to offer Bill a job. We know this is mentioned a little bit in the traditions, but he's offered a very high-paying job because Towns sees Alcoholics Anonymous as another way to get people sober, right? He has the belladonna treatment. He now has Bill's idea, and he thinks, hey, I can make money off of this. I will make Bill a professional therapist at Towns Hospital, and he offers him. So he goes to Clinton Street on the Wednesday meeting, and they tell him it's a really bad idea, and so he doesn't do it. It's the first group conscience. Although you might say the Akron, where they run the idea about the book by everybody would be, but they tell him that. But they need money. They need funds. They're not doing well. So they're trying. This is what when we now have the tradition about attraction rather than promotion. We're all into the promotion phase right now. That comes later. At this point, they're all about promotion. And one of the things they do is they get introduced to John D. Rockefeller Jr., not Senior. John Rockefeller Jr. He's the son of the guy who created Standard Oil, and his friends. And the person who gets them introduced is Dr. Strong, Bill's brother-in-law. And he introduces Bill and others to Willard Richardson, who runs the charities for the Rockefellers. They arrange a meeting at the Rockefeller boardroom, and in attendance there are a lot of notable financial persons and religious leaders. They love the message, worried that money would ruin it. They put $5,000 in a treasury at Riverside Church to help Bill and Dr. Bob, because they know Bill and Dr. Bob are in financial difficulty. So they do give $5,000 out of that first meeting. This is not the dinner that you read about. This is an initial meeting, and it's before the dinner. The dinner happens in the 40s. But this is a bunch of people who have very prominent roles in money charities in New York, including the Rockefeller Foundation, which is one of the biggest charities, if not the biggest in the world at the time. And they end up giving $5,000. And this is interesting. They suggest promotional materials. What are we getting to, guys? We're getting to the book. So what happens is in the spring of 1938, oops, I'm going to skip something here. So they want promotional materials, and they also agree to create the Alcoholic Foundation. And the Alcoholic Foundation is created in the spring of 1938, and it eventually it's all non-AA members, and it eventually becomes the General Service Board of AA. And then basically they're really all the other ideas of raising money, and all they're left with is the big book. And the big book is generated out of the idea of raising money. They need to spread the message, and they need to raise funds. And the biggest advocates of the big book are Bill, Hank Parkhurst, and Jim Burwell. Jim Burwell is the vicious circle, okay, or vicious cycle. And so he must be one of the people who gets in the group. So his story seems a little out of time when you read it in the big book, The Vicious Cycle. But he's actually already pretty. I think it was 1937 or so. He's in the group. And like I told you, in the spring of 1938, the non-alcoholic trustees suggested promotional materials similar to the ones that were presented to them. And out of that, Bill drafts Bill's story, and there's the solution. And it's not clear as to whether he created these as pamphlets to be handed out when they were trying to raise money, or whether they were intended to be just the beginning of the big book. So it's not 100% clear, but and I've seen the original Bill story. It's very, very long. It's very detailed. It's very long. And they have there as a solution. And again, whether they're drafts that eventually go into the big book or just promotional material is not clear, but they're eventually put in the book. They are advanced an offer. They have an offer of an advance to create this book by an entity called Harper Brothers, which is a religious book publisher, and they're offered $1,500 to draft the book. They go into a group conscience, and they decide no. They need to maintain control of the book, and they decide that they are going to create a stock company to fund the publishing of the book. And that is Hank Parkhurst who comes up with that idea, and it's called Works Publishing, Inc. And they're going to make a fortune, guys. That's what they're. So they do stock certificates for donations. So they don't have the $1,500 advance, and so they need to raise money, and so they do it by selling stock in Works Publishing Inc. And Akron loves it because their motto is "Faith without works is dead." So they love Works Publishing. And in New York, their motto is "It works." So they love the name Works. So they both take credit for that name. But it becomes AA Publishing in 1953, and now it's called AA World Services Inc. in 1959. The stock is eventually sold back to the Alcoholic Foundation at par value, which means it's sold back. Like if you paid $1 per share, you got $1 back. So whatever the value of Works Publishing, you didn't get any return. But they felt that all the money should go to the foundation from the publishing of the book, so they bought back the stock at par value. That is the beginning of Hank Parkhurst's resentment. He did not like the fact that he was forced to sell back his stock at the same price that he paid in with no return on his investment. So he's not very happy about it. There's been 4 editions of the Big Book, 1939, 1955, 1976, and 2001. Bill writes the initial draft. He runs it by, 39, 55, 76, 2001. Maybe it's 71. I'm not, but that's why I may have that wrong. But there are 4 editions. Bill writes the first draft, and he runs his first drafts by the group in New York. They give comments, and then he sends it to Akron, and Dr. Bob and the Akron group provide comments. This is creating a lot of stress for Bill. Remember Boomerang, right? He likes to control things. He's got to give his stuff to other people, and they're commenting on it, and then they're further commenting on it, and he is getting very stressed. So one night he decides, I'm going to write how it works. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to write how it works. And he does it in one sitting. And he starts out with 6 steps. So guys, there are no steps yet. So when you hear people say, we're not doing it like they do in 1935, they're right. We're not doing it like in 1935 because they didn't have 12 steps in 1935. So page 69, no laughter, guys. So the 6 steps are as follows. This is what he writes. He goes, sprawling on his bed in anything but spiritual mood, one evening, Wilson poised his yellow pencil over the school tablet propped before him. Quickly, lest he block, he scrawled the words, how it works, across the top of the page, then paused to meditate about the 6-step procedure, which his associates at the previous meeting had agreed pretty well summed up what they were trying to do from the Axer group. 1, we admitted we were licked, that we were powerless over alcohol. 2, we made an inventory of our defects or sins. 3, we confessed or shared our shortcomings with another person in confidence. 4, we made restitution to all those we had harmed by our drinking. 5, we tried to help other alcoholics with no thought of reward in money or prestige. 6, we prayed to whatever God we thought there was for power to practice these precepts. Too preachy, too goody-goody, he winced. Also too complex and even unclear if one did not know about the teachings of the Oxford group. So he's sitting there, he's got the 6 ideas that were given to him by the different members of Alcoholics Anonymous. He writes them down and he's like, I'm not really good with this. So then he decides that he will write, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Then he starts to write, half measure will avail you nothing. You stand at the turning point. Throw yourself under God's protection and care with complete abandon. Now we think you can take it. Here are the steps we took, our program of recovery. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Came to believe that God could restore us to sanity. Made a decision to turn our wills and our lives over to the care of God. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Humbly on our knees asked him to remove our shortcomings. Made a list of all persons we harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Made direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Sought through prayer and meditation to prove our conscious contact with God, praying only knowledge for his will for us and the power to carry out. Having had a spiritual experience as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So that's the original 12 steps. With Wilson paused. His intention was to only break them up into smaller places, our 6 chunks of truth, to be clear and comprehensible as possible. not leaving a single loophole through which the rationalizing alcoholic could wiggle out. Almost idly, he numbered the new steps. They added up to 12. Somehow this number seemed significant. Without any special rhyme or reason, I connected them with the 12 apostles. Feeling great relief now, I commenced to reread the draft. So there is your first 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they're not done until 1939. And he goes to the group, and they're not overly thrilled because they see Bill kind of controlling the situation, but they're okay. And in New York, the problem the conservatives have with it is they felt it wasn't Christian enough. The agnostics and atheists wanted God deleted altogether. Interestingly, they left it up to Bill because they could not resolve what to do with this. They had the people who were pushing the Christian side, and they had a bunch of people pushing taking God out altogether. And they said, Bill, you're the author, you decide. And he goes and he goes over the ideas, and he determines that it's actually Jim Burwell and Hank Parkhurst who are pushing the idea of God as we understand. That was their compromise. They wanted God out, but they would compromise with God as we understand him. And so Bill takes the position of Hank Parkhurst and Jim Burwell, and it's not in the big book anymore, but Hank Parkhurst's story was called The Unbeliever, and Jim Burwell's is The Vicious Cycle, and they're the ones who push God as we understand him, and Bill adopts their approach. He then decides we need a strong finish, and he drafts Vision for You. They need a living proof of that the program works, and they think, what are the ways that we can show how the program works? One, doctor's opinion, right? We have a doctor who knows how it works. Give him the medical diagnosis, give it to him hard, right? And two, they've been told by people, your stories are so important. The non-alcoholics, you really need to tell your stories, right? And so they decide that the two ways are the doctor's opinion and they need stories. So that's why they come up with the stories. And as I told you, initially the first 164 pages was 179 pages. Page one was the doctor's opinion, and it is identical to the doctor's opinion that's in. So it always looks as like two letters, but I haven't really found out, but I think he must have given him a letter in 1935, but then he writes another thing in 1939. They put them together and they put them in the big book. Page 10 was Bill's story. And there, as I told you, there were 401 changes made to the first 164 pages. The biggest one to me was the difference between spiritual experience and spiritual awakening. And that was done in 1940. And Bill was having difficulty. People didn't believe him about this bright light experience, or he didn't think it was helpful because a lot of people weren't having that. And they were staying sober. So he backs off of. If you read Bill's story, he doesn't tell that. When I read you that, he does not have that in his story. He goes with the spiritual awakening, and they put that appendix in 1940 in the second printing, and they changed the 12th step to spiritual awakening in 1940 because they're having difficulty conveying what the spiritual experience. And they said, well, wait, it's a spiritual awakening. And so that, to me, was a huge. I didn't realize that. You know, I always thought the 12 steps were the 12 steps. I didn't know there were 6. I didn't know that they had a rough draft, and then they came up with it. But they polished it off. Now they got to name the book, right? So here's another interesting thing. Bill misspells it. So instead of Alcoholics Anonymous, as we have it here, he has it Alcoholic apostrophe S Anonymous. So the first thing he writes down is Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, this is a great debate. Who came up with Alcoholics Anonymous? Cleveland claims that they came up with Alcoholics Anonymous because they had a lot of Catholics. There weren't a lot of Catholics in Alcoholics Anonymous. In fact, there were none in New York because they came through the Episcopal Church, and the Catholics, you weren't allowed to do other religions. You had to abide by the Catholic faith. And so Cleveland had a lot of Catholics, and so they didn't want to be associated with the Oxford group. So they claim that they were the ones that came up with Alcoholics Anonymous. It appears that New York was using the term as well. And we saw the Alcoholic Squadron. There's a lot of things thrown out, but they're trying to come up with the book. They come up with Alcoholics Anonymous, 100 Men, The Way Out, The Way, and Alcoholics Anonymous without the apostrophe S. So Akron wanted The Way Out. The New York group favored Alcoholics Anonymous. How were they going to come to a compromise? So you have New York and Akron. You've got Akron saying we love The Way Out, and you have New York saying we want Alcoholics Anonymous. So what do? Hey, Fitz, you're down in Washington, D.C., trying to form a group of Alcoholics Anonymous in Washington, D.C. Fitz Mayo, why don't you go over to the Library of Congress and research this? So he goes over to the Library of Congress. There are 25 books at the Library of Congress called The Way Out. There are 12 books called The Way, and there are no books called Alcoholics Anonymous. So that's how they come up with the name. But again, compromise, right? They then circulate this. Everybody's heard this story. Like they get this big PO box in Grand Central Station. They think they're gonna, and they send this all book out to all these medical doctors and religious people. They open up the thing and there's only like 12 requests for copies. My understanding is what they did is they sent the initial edition around to doctors and medical religious people to get comments. They didn't want to offend anybody. If you notice, I mentioned this at Early Risers, there is no mention of the word disease in the doctor's opinion or the first 164 pages. That is purposeful. They did not want to use disease because they thought they would piss off the medical community by equating it to disease, and it had not been determined to be a medical disease yet. So even though Dr. Silkworth thought it was a medical disease, he changes it to allergy, and they do not use the word disease, and that's because they're just afraid of somehow losing the medical profession, and they didn't want to lose their help. The other thing, though, is the religious people came back. They were really high on the book. They had no comments. Some really leading religious Catholics and others, they loved it. There was a psychiatrist in New Jersey, Dr. Howard, who favored that they change shoulds and musts to suggestions. So that's why they talk about the suggested steps. Now we got to come up with a price, guys, right? Got to come up. Hank, he wants the money, right? $3.50. Alcoholics are like, it's a lot of money. How about $1 or $2? But they end up with $3.50. And the compromise is they're going to print it on the thickest paper they can, aka the big book. That's why it's so thick. They're going to charge $3.50, but they're like, you got to get a big bang for your buck. And so to get the biggest bang for the buck, you got to print it on the thickest paper you can, and that's why it's such a thick book. But they go with $3.50. We now have a problem. The printer won't give them the books. They don't have any money. They can't pay for the books. So they've gone and printed them. And the printer says, I'm not taking an IOU. We want money. So what happens? Fitz Mayo's sister comes to the rescue, and she writes a check for $1,000 in advance, an IOU to AA, and they use the $1,000 and they get the books. So if you're thinking it's a big, we're doing great, they're so out of money that they have to borrow $1,000 to even get their books. So we're off to the races now. It's 1939. We have the book. Here's the next thing that's interesting. They are moved. St. Akron City Hospital doesn't like Alcoholics Anonymous very much because we don't pay. Okay, we go in, we want charitable services, guys, and that wasn't working for them. So he shifts to St. Thomas Hospital. This is Dr. Bob, and St. Thomas Hospital is staffed by the Sisters of Charity of St. Augustine, and that is Sister Ignatia, and she is the leader of that group, and she and Dr. Bob work to get alcoholics treated there. She is the patron saint of Alcoholics Anonymous. She's the one who gets treatment for alcoholics at St. Thomas Hospital. In 1939, Dr. Bob moves the meetings from the Williams house back to his house because they're starting to break with the Oxford group, and then eventually they move to the King School. And if you've gone to Founders Day or you've gone to Akron, they still have a meeting at the King School, and that's when they break with the Oxford group. By October 1939, AA is firmly established as a separate entity. The age of publicity starts up. In 1939, we have the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and they write a series of articles in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and much to the chagrin of the members of Alcoholics Anonymous, the Cleveland Plain Dealer picks a chronic relapser as the person they write the article about, but they don't care, and it actually is all very positive. Then Fulton Osler writes an article in Liberty Magazine. A guy named Morgan R. is interviewed on a nationwide radio program. So again, attraction, not promotion. It seems that it's all about promotion at this point. Then they have a guy named Rollie Helmsley. Anybody know who Rollie Helmsley is? He's a really good catcher for the Cleveland Indians. Nice. And he's a drunk. and he's really good, and then he becomes kind of bad. He's sobered up by the Cleveland Alcoholics Anonymous, and guess what? He's the catcher for Bob Feller. Does anybody know who Bob Feller is? One of the greatest pitchers of all time. And sometimes they match up a catcher with a pitcher. They have a good rapport, and he's the guy for Bob Feller. And there's a lot of promotion about this. The newspapers love it that he's gotten sober and that he's helping out the Cleveland Indians win games because he's catching Bob Feller. And Bob Feller's a really young guy, and he's doing really well. February 8th, 1940 is the big dinner at the Union Club that you read about in the traditions. This is the meeting that's going to be hosted by John D. Rockefeller Jr. The Union Club, we don't hear about these as much. I think there's a Union Club in Philadelphia, but they are big-time money dealers. They're the Star Chamber people. They're the ones who control the scenes behind the scenes. And the Union Club is going to host a dinner, and Dr. Bob and Bill are to speak, along with some others, not necessarily members of the group, but others. John Rockefeller is too sick to attend. He sends Nelson Rockefeller, who is his son, to host. And good old Nelson Rockefeller at the end says, AA should be self-supporting, don't give them any money. So there's a little bit of ego deflation going on there, but they do take in about $3,000 in donations from that. But this is where they start to realize they got to do it kind of on their own. The office of the group moves from Hank Parkhurst's office in Newark, New Jersey to 30 Vesey Street, Suite 703 in Lower Manhattan. Bill and Lois have lost the Clinton Street house at this point, and they're living upstairs at this location in Lower Manhattan. The move angered Hank Parkhurst. Bill had bought the furniture from Hank Parkhurst at one point. I guess he was having trouble, and Bill moves the furniture, which does not make Hank very happy. And it remains a point between them for the rest of their lives. And in fact, Bill pays for the furniture 3 times because Hank would come drunk and demand payment for the furniture, and to avoid conflict, Bill would write him a check. And he did that 2 more times. So there's records that he paid for the office furniture 3 times from Hank. But he does it again just to avoid conflict. Late in the winter of 1940 comes the next big moment. This is when Father Dowling arrives. And Father Dowling is a Jesuit priest. And he shows up because he's been reading about Alcoholics Anonymous, and he believes it's very close to the teachings of St. Francis, I think, or no? St. Ignatius. And he comes to find out about it, and Bill's in a heavy state of depression. There's a knock. He's like, F these alcoholics. I'm tired of them. I'm tired. I don't feel good. I can't turn somebody away. They may die of alcoholism. I'll answer the door. This is a powerful moment for Bill. He's in a high state of depression. He does a 4th and 5th step with Father Dowling. Father Dowling just sits and listens to him. At the end, he says, you know what your problem is, Bill? Your ego. You try to control everything. You're unhappy because you cannot control alcoholics. What a surprise, right? You cannot control alcoholics, and that is what's making you happy. And to be happy, you have to let go. So Bill goes from leading AA to starting into the motion of moving out of AA, not in the sense of leaving AA altogether, but he starts to realize at this point, this is one of his character defects, is his need to control. And his need to control is causing him spiritual problems. And so he starts to move from that. He realizes ego is problem, control is his problem, and he starts going with the let go and let God. Another big moment is March 1, 1941. This is when Jack Alexander, he's an author famous for exposés on hucksters and frauds. And he decides to invent this fraudulent group called Alcoholics Anonymous. He's going to go investigate them. Instead of a negative report, Jack Alexander writes a glowing review of AA. The name of the article is Alcoholics Anonymous Freed Slaves of Drink. Now They Free Others. So if you've ever wondered what the name of the article is, it's Alcoholics Anonymous Freed Slaves of Drink. Now They Free Others. Jack Alexander actually helps Bill write the 12 and 12. So they remain friends, and he helps Bill edit the 12 and 12 and later on. Rapid growth follows this art. This is the big growth spurt in AA. They go from 2,000 to 8,000 people almost immediately after this. Before the article, almost all growth was done face-to-face by AA members traveling in the U.S., and after the article, the book becomes more widely distributed and growth comes from the book. So this is a big turning point. This article is one of the most important points in the early stages, and it's really where they start really growing in leaps and bounds. Now we go to no central authority. So we have Bill with, and we go through and we have Rule 62. So I'm trying to throw little things in. So Rule 62 is in early 1940, a group writes bill, and they say we have 61 rules. Not only do we have 61 rules, but we have regulations and bylaws for our group. They, of course, fail. They fall apart. They get back together, and the member writes Bill with a card that he sent to all other AA groups about Rule 62. Rule 62 is don't take yourself so damn seriously. And that is where that comes from. So there was a group in 1940 who decided they were going to come up with all these rules and regulations. They had a lot of problems, but they didn't drink. They survived, but afterwards they sent a letter to everybody, basically a mea culpa, right, and saying don't take yourself so damn seriously. The lack of central authority is criticized by outsiders, especially one of Bill's therapists, a guy named Dr. Henry DEYPAA. Loves Bill, thinks Bill is immature. He says the leaders of AA are abdicating responsibility and acting immaturely. He thinks they should have presidents and controlling people, and the fact that you don't have them is you're abdicating. You're immature, you won't take responsibility, and you should. And Bill ignores him. They actually have some pretty nasty back and forth. In April of 1946, Bill publishes the 12 suggested points for the AA tradition. This is the long form of the 12 traditions. It's later shortened and added to the big book, but the first time the 12 traditions show up is a thing called the 12 suggested points for the AA tradition. In mid-1941, AA sets up an office near Grand Central Station. In the 1940s, Hank Parkhurst relapses, mostly over relationships. So they have a secretary. Her name's Ruth Hawk. She's in New Jersey, and Hank Parkhurst is in love with her. And he divorces his wife, and he asks Ruth Hawk to marry him, and Ruth Hawk says no. She says not only no, but I'm going to New York where they're opening. Remember I told you that they opened that office in Lower Manhattan where he lived, Bill and Lois lived. She leaves New Jersey and goes to New York. Now I've heard 13 step issues about him and Ruth, but I'm not sure that may have been spread by Hank. I don't know that Bill's a saint, but Hank Parkhurst is very upset by this. He is in love with Ruth Hawk, and she is basically not in love with him. She refuses his offer of marriage, and she goes with Bill to New York City, and she's a long time a secretary for AA. And probably in June 1942, Hank Parkhurst and others contend that Bill and Dr. Bob are mismanaging the finances of AA, that they may have stolen as much as $50,000. Bill and Dr. Bob meet with the Cleveland Group and with an auditor. The books are audited, and they are 100% valid. By 1950, Bill and Dr. Bob are starting to step away from leadership. On November 16, 1950, Dr. Bob dies of colon cancer, and he's buried with Ann Smith at Mount Peach Cemetery Hospital in Ohio. In 1953, Bill publishes the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. Bill, at least according to some of the sources, he advocated changing the first 164 pages. He believed in the evolution of the message, but he understood that other people did not. And so instead of forcing that on the people who wanted the 164 pages to stay the same, the 12 and 12 is his second big book, sort of. It's his experiences with the 12 steps and the 12 traditions, and it's mostly his experiences in the 40s. And it's his way of showing what he thinks. I came up with these 12 steps in 1939, and here's been my experience with the 12 steps. I'm not going to shove them in the big book, but I'll do the 12 and 12. And he publishes that in 1953, and on page 132, one motive impelling Bill to write 12 Steps and 12 Traditions had been the realization that the original text of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, had become frozen, too sacred for even its principal author's taste. Yet because of the phenomenal success of the original edition, Wilson and virtually all other members were wary of change. The modification in one of the early printings that had substituted spiritual awakening for spiritual experience in the 12th step was made more consistent in other scattered references, and the words Disease, cure, and ex-alcoholic were most carefully avoided. The first generally replaced by illness, and the second and third by advertising to the persistence of the condition. But the 12 and 12 is his sort of way of going about it. Trying to wrap up, then I'll go to some of the fun little nits. Bill leaves leadership in 1955. There's a convention in 1955. There's a second edition, and he's like, I'm out. He isn't. He just thinks everybody keeps looking to him for, like, okay, well, let's do this, right, Bill? Let's do this, right, Bill? And he doesn't have Dr. Bob anymore. And remember, he's let go and let God. So he's coming up with, how do I do this? And so in 1955, he tells everybody, I'm stepping away from any type of leadership role. In 1960s, Bill, under the supervision of medical doctors, experimented with LSD and vitamin B treatments. This is a fact, okay? People talk about Bill used drugs in the 60s. He's a hypocrite. He used LSD. He also used these really heavy vitamin B supplements. This is true. He is not a drug addict going off and using LSD. Remember I talked about how he went from spiritual experience to spiritual awakening? Remember the belladonna treatment with the hallucinogens? Bill is convinced that if he can help alcoholics if he can get them that white light experience. He thinks LSD might be the answer. He goes to California, and in a clinical study, he experiments with LSD. He is not going around buying LSD from drug dealers on the street. Okay, but he does, and he's trying to recreate the type of moment he experienced in 1934 to help other alcoholics, and he dies on January 24th, 1971. So, just to talk, so there's like the beginning to the alpha and the omega with Bill. But here's some fun things that are in the big book, and we'll end with these. They're kind of like little stories. So we have Bill Dotson. I mentioned him, alcoholic number 3, Bill number 2. He was omitted from the first. His story is not in the first edition of the big book. There are lots of different reasons for this. One, they felt he was not very representative. Remember, he's a very successful lawyer. He's an ex-city councilman, and he also was violent when he was drinking. And so he was not one of the people they placed front and center in the stories. That's one theory. Second theory is he wanted to be paid for his story, and they didn't have any money. The other was he's too humble, and that the other one is he really didn't have that much. He didn't think the big book was going to make it, so he didn't really have any interest in writing a story, and so he didn't do it. But he is convinced to write his story in 1952. He writes what is Alcoholic Number 2, the second story in the stories. And Bill convinced him in 1952 to write it. He dies in 1954, and they put his story in the big book in 1955. Everybody thinks of Marty Mann as the first woman in AA. She writes Women Suffer Too. That's not true. She did not. First of all, she didn't stay sober. She relapsed, but then she got sober and stayed sober and died sober. But she's not. It's actually Florence Rankin. She's the first person. She's the first woman to get sober in AA. She wrote a story called A Feminine Victory. It was added and it was in the big book. She got sober in 1937. She relapsed in 1939. She could not stay sober. She committed suicide and was discovered by Fitz Mayo. He tried to get her into she was in D.C. He was trying to get her into the group in D.C. She disappears. Fitz Mayo hears a rumor that she may be dead. He goes down to the morgue and he finds Florence Rankin in the morgue. One of the reasons, by the way, that they did not agree, that they decided not to use 100 men was because of her. She was one of the members in 1939 when they were writing the book, and they thought it would be inappropriate to call it 100 men because there was not just 100 men, there was a woman. So she's the feminine victory, and unfortunately, she didn't make it. Fitz Mayo, his name is really Fitzhugh Mayo. He was born in 1897. He died in 1943 of cancer. He's mentioned in a doctor opinion. He's the person rescued from the barn. He's from a prominent family on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was one of the Christian values members of AA. He was the guy who wanted Christian in the big book. His father was a minister. And when the group was deciding a name for the big book, he was the guy who went, since he was in D.C., he's the guy who went to the Library of Congress. And again, he died sober in 1943. And he started AA in Washington, D.C. Hank Parkhurst, 1885 to 1954. His story was called The Unbeliever. He did not believe in God. He believed in a universal power. He was a Standard Oil of New Jersey executive. If you wonder what Standard Oil of New Jersey is, every time you go to an Exxon station, that's Standard Oil of New Jersey. So he was a big executive with Standard Oil. He was fired for drinking. He sought treatment at Towns Hospital, and he met Bill in 1935. He stayed sober for over 5 years before relapsing, and Lois notes in her diary that September 6, 1939, Hank is drunk, is what she writes. He's mentioned in the doctor's opinion. He's also mentioned in A Vision for You on page 163. He is the man who was living in a large community. So if you look in A Vision for You on 163, he's the man who was living in a large community. He and Jim Burwell fought against the use of God in the Big Book, and he is the person in Two Employers. And it's not sure whether he wrote it or he narrated it to Bill, but he is the person who's talking in Two Employers. Jim Burwell, I'm going to spend a little time. He's pretty important. 1898 to 1974. He's among the first 10 members of AA on the East Coast, and along with Hank Parkhurst, he pushed the God Not Be Mentioned in the Big Book. His compromise of God as You Understand Me is credited to him. He was instrumental in the publication of the all-important Saturday Evening Post article by Jack Alexander that brought national publicity to AA in March of 1941. As mentioned by Bill W. in the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, Jim B. is credited with the adoption of the AA's third tradition. The only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. In the foreword to the first edition of Alcoholics Anonymous, historically prior to the standardization of the 12 steps, it was stated that the only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. But Jim Burwell is the person that led to the use of just a desire to stop drinking. The long form of the third tradition now reads, our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism. Hence, we may refuse none who wish to recover, nor ought AA membership ever depend on money or conformity. Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that, as a group, they have no other affiliation. According to Clarence Snyder, who's the early member of the Cleveland group of AA, Jimmy remained steadfast throughout his life and preached his particular non-God brand of AA wherever he went. His story, The Vicious Cycle, was published in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th editions of the Big Book. He's buried in Christ Episcopal Church in Owensville, Maryland, near his boyhood friend, John Henry Fitzhugh Mayo, known as Fitz. Jim and Fitz were among the first members to get sober with Bill W. in New York. Now we have Earl Treat, Mr. T. He sold himself short. He's also the heavy smoker and coffee drinker mentioned in Family Afterwards. So he's the guy whose wife hounded him about his smoking and his drinking. So if you've ever wondered who's the guy in the Family Afterwards at the end of the story, that's the guy, Earl Treat. He's in the story. He sold himself short. He convinced Bill to codify the AA experience, which led to the 12 points to assure our future, first published in 1946 and are the long form of the 12 traditions. He convinced Bill to shorten them into what is known as the 12 traditions on our walls. In his story, he talks about the 6 steps, which were originally used in the Flying Blind period, which were complete deflation, dependence and guidance from a higher power, moral inventory, confession, restitution, and continued work with alcoholics. Okay, so anybody wonder who Fred is? Remember Fred the accountant? He's in More on Alcoholism. He's actually a guy named Harry Brick. Harry Brick is an accountant. His story was called A Different Slant. He eventually relapsed. He's kind of a Hank Parkhurst type, and he sued AA for return of money he had paid for stock in Work Publishing. And he was a short-time member of the Alcoholic Foundation Board. He relapsed. Now, he, along with Hank Parkhurst, they were, I think, a little embarrassed by it, so they didn't go back to AA. I think this guy actually did stay sober. He stayed sober out of AA. Hank Parkhurst didn't, and he died drunk. But so just in quick, and those are fun. But just another thing, I was researching this because I was interested. Once I found out who Fred was, I wondered, like, who's Jim? And a lot of people assume Jim is Jim Burwell, That's not true. Jim Burwell never owned a automobile or dealership, so it can't be him. Plus, uh, he didn't. That's not how he relapsed. So if you go to More on Alcoholism, the person where they talk about a man of 30 was doing a great deal of spree drinking. He was very nervous in the morning after these bouts and quieted himself with more liquor. He was ambitious to succeed, but could see that he could go nowhere if he drank at all. And once he started, he had no control whatever. That is Richard Peabody. He's the guy who wrote Common Sense of Drinking, and that's the person that's widely known to be that person. So we get now to Jim. Our first example is a friend we shall call Jim. Jim is either a guy named Ralph Furlong or Harlan Spencer. Harlan Spencer is the person who owned an automobile lot. The problem is Harlan Spencer is from Akron, and Jim in the big book is from the East Coast. And so they can't figure out. So they know that Harlan is the guy who owned an automobile dealership, had to sell it, worked for them, and relapsed. But Ralph Furlong is the person on the East Coast that was working with Bill and was visited 6 times, like the person Jim was. And so there's a dispute as to whether Ralph Furlong or Harlan Spencer is Jim from the Big Book. But there is each of these. I don't know why they changed the names to protect the innocent, but there is every person in here. If you research it hard enough, you can find where they hook up in the book. And like I mentioned in More on Alcohol, on A Doctor's Opinion, um, we know that Bill is the man with over 100. The man and over 100 have appeared to recover. That's Bill Wilson. And then he talks about Bill Wilson, where he says, many years ago, one of the leading contributors to this book came under our care in this hospital. And while there, he acquired some ideas, which he put into practical experience. That's Bill Wilson. When he mentions about 1 year prior to this experience, a man was brought in to be treated for chronic alcoholism. He had but partially recovered from a gastric hemorrhage and seemed to be a case of pathological mental deterioration. That's Hank Parkhurst. And he said, following the elimination of alcohol, there was found to be no permanent brain injury. He accepted the plan outlined in this book. 1 year later, he called to see me, and I experienced a very strange sensation. I knew the man by name and partially recognized his features, but there all resemblance ended. That's Hank Parkhurst. And then when I need a mental uplift, I often think of another case brought in by a physician prominent in New York. The patient had made his own diagnosis and deciding his situation was hopeless, had hidden in a deserted bar and determined to die. He was rescued by a searching party and in desperate condition brought to me. That's Fitzmayo. So of the people, we now know who the guy who smokes too much is. We know Jim is, maybe. We know who Fred is. We know who the two employer is. We know the people in there. And I just, that's where I'll end. I always find those things are fun when you're in the meetings. When you, like, for instance, when you get to Earl T and you have the woman who talks about being visited by Mr. T, that's the person when he sold himself short. And it's just really fun stuff. And the thing that really helps me with this, and again, people have different histories and they'll hear things, and I don't know if they're right or they're wrong. This is just what I know, and you have to take it for that. But what I really love about it, as I told you before, I came into AA thinking I had to be perfect to stay sober. Like one of the things I remember a person saying in a meeting, before I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I lied all the time. And since I've come to Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found it necessary to lie. And I thought, I lie all the time. I'm going to drink, right? Because I tell white lies all the time. What is going to happen to me? And the thing is nothing. And that's why when you go through and you do the history, you don't have to be perfect. The message is you don't have to be God. You're not God. There is a God, and it ain't you, Eric. And that's what's so powerful about this stuff to me. The history is so powerful. Like, think about Earl's story is in the big book. He sold himself short. That means he died sober. They take your story out if you died drunk. So he stays sober, but he is in the family afterwards. He is a relapser. His story is important to you. He's in there to show you don't have to be perfect, right? He had to double his spiritual efforts, is what it said in the family. So You don't have to. That's what I love about the history is what I do when I found about the history is it just showed me how I didn't have to be perfect. All I had to do was not drink one day at a time and work the steps and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. But I didn't have to be perfect. And seeing our members and all their flaws doesn't hurt that. It supports it. So let's say Bill did have something with his secretary. So what? Does that mean that the steps don't count? Does it matter that they didn't have a perfect idea in 1935? And you hear people, my other one is like you can't talk about drugs in an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. Where does it say that? It does not say that in the big book. In fact, Bill is talking about using sedatives. It doesn't say that in the big book. Big book. Acceptance is the answer used to be called physician, addict, alcoholic. Addict. It's one of the most beautiful stories in the big book. And they eventually changed it to acceptance is the answer because of the famous passage in there. But it's mentioned. It does not say there that we do not go to doctors. So when people say you can't go to therapy, all you should do is go to AA. It doesn't say that. It says we use other people. We use priests, ministers, therapists, and doctors. And they do not say that AA is the only way to get sober in the big book. They say it's the way that worked best for them. It's in two employers. And it says specifically in there, it may work. There may be other methods. Well, this is the one that we have found works best for us. That's what I love about the history. It's not perfect. It's great. So thanks.
So sorry. So we are going to have a quick Ask It Basket. So if you haven't had an opportunity and this has prompted any questions for you, come up and write them really quickly, and Eric will do his best to answer them. So I have a few right here. So we're just going to start with it. Answer. So the first one says, what was Bill Wilson's experience with Ellis? So we know he used it, but what was his?
It didn't work. So he abandoned it pretty quickly, actually. He abandoned it for two reasons. One, it didn't work. And two, people in AA were saying, Bill, it doesn't look good. You're going off and using LSD. The other thing he was using was these, I can't remember, it was vitamin B6 or something, but he was having that injected into him to try and create the white light experience. It's a very short period in his life, but it didn't work, obviously. And he abandoned it for two reasons. One, it didn't work. And two, he was getting criticized for it.
All right, the next one is, I was always told Lois's cousin married to Rockefeller. I think we covered on this, but and that's how that introduction happened. Is that true?
So my understanding is that Lois's sister married that Dr. Stone, and Dr. Stone was friends with members of the Rockefeller group, and it's him who brings the Rockefellers to the table. So it's close. Cousin, sister. That's the type of thing. Maybe it is a cousin. I don't know, but she's married to this doctor who actually knows the guy who's head of the Rockefeller charities. So that's probably pretty close.
This next one asks, did Bill Wilson invent the 13th step?
I've read that, but it sounds like Abby was there too. Look, Dr. Bob hated, one of the things he hated about groups is when people hooked up with each other. So he didn't seem to have a problem with Bill. He loved Bill. Bill and he were very much, they died as very, very close friends. I think if Bill was that big of a philanderer, Dr. Bob may have had a problem with it. But did he? I don't know. I've read he has, and I've read he hasn't. So, sometimes you have people who like to bring down people, and sometimes you have people who over idolize people too. Usually the truth lands somewhere in between. I have seen pictures of him and Lois when they were both young, and they're a very striking couple. She's a very tall, beautiful woman. He's very tall, a handsome man. They're kind of I think I've seen their wedding picture. They're a pretty hot couple.
All right, this next one is, was it actually 100, was the first 100 people, was it actually 100 people?
That's what they talk about. The book, one of the first changes you'll see if you're reading it is, in those changes, is they change 100 to 1,000. So they must have felt in 1939 that they had 100 solid members. And we saw that one of the titles was 100 Men. So they must have really thought that was a true number. I don't know. I don't have any evidence one way or the other. That's, the other thing that when you read in the second thing, they talk about the success rate of AA. I don't know how you track that. Plus, when you read all these stories about different people in AA, it sounds like a lot of them were sober, relapse, sober. The thing is, just keep coming back, right? A lot of them make it, but they don't. They're not perfect. So, 100 men, I don't know. Sounds right. We talked about how at one point they felt they had 40, and a couple of years later, 100 seems about right.
Another question that came in is whether Bill Wilson's use of he or him in the big book, whether that had any prominence, and the capitalization of certain words, whether that's important.
Again, if you look at, I think that we were talking about a society in the 30s that was masculine based. So I don't think it was done to exclude women purposely. It was probably just more the way it was at the time. I don't agree or disagree with it. I just think that's the reality. So they do it. The he, I think, it probably was okay. The he that's capitalized is God. That's specifically, it's not him. It's referring to the God as you understand him. But I think one of the things I noticed about the 401 changes is they spotted where they made mistakes, and they weren't afraid to. Oops, we forgot the letter. A person as opposed to person. They would put the A in. So it's pretty edited by now. So those types of things are purposeful. It is very crafted. It's not, it's not just they wrote it 1 minute and then it was perfect. They edited it a lot and subsequently, obviously.
That was all the questions in the Ask It basket. I didn't know if anyone had a question. You can raise your hand. I'll bring over the mic.
I have a question, but I can project my voice. I don't need the microphone.
Thanks, everybody.
No problem. So in the big book when he talks about meditate, is he talking about like is it I guess like he says meditate, like does he mean like what does he mean when he says meditate?
I read about that early on, that one of the things that hit them early in the program was that people that were having trouble staying sober were not in the morning sitting calmly and thinking about their day ahead and how they were going to meet the issues that they were going to have to meet, and that was one of the meditations. If you read the 12 and 12, it's a totally different. But remember, from what I learned, the 12 and 12 is his experiences over his lifetime up till that point where he writes it. The 1939 is not all of his experiences. It's just frozen in time AA in 1939. So it could have come from somebody else, but one of the things that they felt was that people weren't sitting in the morning quietly thinking about the day ahead. And now there's also the notion that at night you meditate. That's mentioned too, in both when they just talk about the 10th and 11th. And then the other thing, that meditation was a big thing that they started pressing. And the second thing was, did you have reservations? That was they were trying to figure out, why do we lose people? And people who stayed sober and worked the steps, why are we losing these people? It should work, right? And they came up with the notion that you have reservations. So meditation and reservations were something they focused on later on in trying to help people. So I don't know exactly what he meant by it, but one of the things was they felt that people weren't sitting down in the morning and calmly thinking about what they were going to have to run into that day.
No, I think I'm all right. Specifically for Bill and Lois, but as a whole, what were they doing for money to survive during their early?
Well, I think it's a different day and age then. I don't think you had rent controlled apartments in New York. I think things were a little cheaper. First of all, her family supported them. She worked in a department store and helped pay. And then over time, AA became. I think the notion of, I didn't realize, like, you think about how poor they sound, but then Bill buys the furniture from Hank Parker. So I haven't really researched. He did not have a job, so it must have been from people donating money to AA, like that 3,000 that came in here, 1,000 from the printing, of the 5,000 from the initial meeting. So there must have been other benefactors that provided, but I can't remember. I did remember reading at one point they felt comfortable enough that that's why they don't accept outside contributions. They did accept outside contributions at one point, but they stopped once they became solid because they didn't want outside influence. So they stopped taking outside contributions because they were stable and they didn't want outside influence. And that's also why they eventually changed the board from non-alcoholics to alcoholics.
I have a follow-up question. Oh, got one in the back.
Some years ago, 10 plus maybe, we put out a large manuscript edit. How accurate is all of that?
So I've read that. It's pretty cool. The question is, which is that the first one they wrote up and put to a publisher, or is that the one he was sending around? I don't know. It's pretty neat. If you read it, you can see where they edit on that. If you get a chance to look at it, do it. It's pretty interesting. And there are things that you see in there that help you. It can help you if you look at the fact of how they're thinking and maybe what you're thinking. You see other alcoholics thought the same way you do. It's pretty. You do see where he changes God to God as you understand him. That's in that version. The way I understood is he would write things up. He'd go to the group at Clinton Street. He'd get their comments. He'd rewrite them and he'd send them to Akron for Dr. Bob, and then the Akron people, and he'd send it back, and then he would stressfully try and compromise everything. So that's what I saw in the non-alcoholic versions of it, but I've seen that. I don't know which version that is. Whether it's obviously it's not the yellow pad that he used because it's a typed version. But he was writing down on a yellow pad, but I've seen that. It's pretty cool. I would recommend if you get a chance to look at it.
Yeah, so you being like a historian and stuff, I'm just curious what your feelings towards the new changes of what will influence stuff, you know what I mean? I don't want an opinion, right? I'm just saying your feeling, you know what I mean? Basically, do you think it's going to affect the history of the program?
History is the history, but my personal thing, and this is worth, nothing. I don't see why you can't coexist. Like you have the original, man, you have the original, and you don't say, okay, we're in 2024, let's change the Bible to what did Christ really look like, was, that type of stuff. You can coexist with that. You can do it. But, it is a program of inclusiveness, and it's also a program of love and patience. And if certain people feel excluded because of two wives or the way that certain things are written, I'm not a person who believes in hurting people. And if it hurts somebody, I'm not for it. And if it's that big a deal, who am I to make that determination? I did think it was interesting. I forgot to mention this. In the original Big Book, there are a lot of non-alcoholic stories in the first edition. One of which is a story written by a woman about being a wife of an alcoholic. She may also be one of the persons who helped draft Two Wives. There's the notion that Bill just wrote it on his own. She may have actually contributed to that, but I'm not. I'll leave that to smarter people. I think you'll always have a home for. And look, we have meetings for atheists now. Why can't you have meetings for old big books and whatever, and let people make their decision? But I just don't believe in hurting people, and if people are hurt by those things, who am I?
Yeah, Bill.
You have a question, Bill?
No, I'm just put my hand
I did have two questions. One is more of I had been told that most of the Big Book was actually typed by the secretary, Ruth Hawk. Is that accurate?
Yes, she wrote it. She typed it in New Jersey. That we know. Yeah. As you were talking about that manuscript that they have, she typed that. I think they still have the original typewriter in the headquarters in New York, along with the original coffee pot. If you get a chance, go there. It's pretty cool. They have a lot of historical things there, yeah, they have the original typewriter, and she typed it up. That was Hank Parkhurst had a business selling car. He was going to compete with Exxon, and he had that office over in I can't remember if it was in Newark, New Jersey, or if it was just right across. But yeah, she typed that up.
All right, and my second one was I was also informed that the italics part of the Big Book was important for the reason that in the early printings, it cost additional money to italicize certain letters. So whenever in the big book you see something italicized, it meant they spent additional money to have that highlighted or somehow. I was wondering if you know anything.
So I didn't do as much. I was doing the history of AA, not the history of the big book. So I didn't look into that type of specific thing. I just picked up some fun trivial stuff like the woman who gave the money, Fitzmayo's sister who gave the money. My sponsor always told me when it's italicized, it means something extra. But that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense to me, but that even makes it more important. I mean, that's cool. That's a cool fact. Thick. Bang for your buck, Mark.
I'm Mark. Thank you, Eric, for being of service. Really, I've learned a lot today. Forgive my recall of the big book, but isn't there a story? I don't know if you touched on it, but isn't there a story in the big book about the equivalent of Bill W., a guy from Canada that was the equivalent of Bill W. that got the program started in Canada? A story in the big book.
Well, I don't know if he's the equivalent. I mean, Bill Wilson. There's no equivalent person of Bill and Dr. Bob. Ebby might be the person. Well, he may have started. Earl Treat started Chicago. Fitzmayo started Washington. There's probably a person in there who started it in Canada, but he didn't. He probably got it from Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob. So I didn't do. I have actually. It's super long. I didn't print it, but there is a really cool. If you go in on the internet, there's a cool thing done about each original story and who the person was. And that's how I found out about the woman who wrote a story about being a wife of an alcoholic, and the anecdote that she might have actually been the person who helped Bill write Two Wives. But yeah, I just bristled with the notion of equivalent. I think you think about the history. You got Roland Hazard, Ebby Thatcher, Bill, and Dr. Bob. I'm not really sure there's any equivalence to those four. There are people then who are derivative from that, but those are the big four, and then the people from that are derivative, like Bill Dotson, who's not an Oxford Group member, who gets sober. He's derivative of Dr. Bob and Bill visiting him. This guy from Canada, I think, gets sober in Akron and goes back to Canada. Sure. Well, I didn't go into this because it was long enough as it was. They initially sent people either to Towns Hospital, New York group, or they sent them to Dr. Bob in Akron. So if you were in Cleveland and you met up with members of AA, one of the things they did is they sent you to Akron. At a certain point, they say, wait a second, we can't send everybody to New York and Akron. We have to start growing up. And so they then form other groups. So they really pushed members. If you read some of the stories, stick around long enough to read the stories, you'll see people are told, okay, that's great. Now go create an AA group in your own city. And here are a bunch of letters for you to answer. I think that's a guy in Detroit. He's given letters and told, get people sober, dude. That's your job. Don't send them to Akron. Take them in up there. Find your own, and so they do that. But no, they were pretty hardcore in their own cities. Bill was in New York, and Dr. Bob was in Akron. Clarence Snyder was the big guy in Cleveland, and they then branch out. Fitzmayo in New York, Earl Treat in Chicago, but no, they were prophets in their own cities. I hadn't heard that, but they did travel up, and they did travel a lot. Bill traveled a lot to speak.
I wasn't aware when you said this, but you said something about the alleged cheating of Bill with Ruth, right? Maybe.
I've read it in the Susan Cheever book. He does.
So she speaks that. So that just for everyone to clarify, she speaks about it at an AA meeting.
Did she?
Yeah, I have a speaker tape. I can send it out. But she talks about her, Ebby, Bill, and another woman being in bed laughing together. But she clarifies that there was no